I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this Word in Your Ear podcast, videocast thing for which there is no name. Mark Ellen and I have been creating in this line since 2007. And if any of it has met with your approval, then please click to subscribe because it helps. Leave a comment because we like to hear from you, and maybe even consider becoming a Patreon supporter because then, well, you'll be one of us. Visit patreon.com/wordinyourear for details. Well, welcome to another Word in Your Ear. And today we're joined by somebody I frankly have to describe as music book royalty. I'm delighted to get the opportunity to talk to the great Peter Guralnick. Hello, Peter.
I can't live up to that description.
Well, I'm sure you will. And I'm sure, I've long enjoyed Peter's books about American music, sweet soul music, Feel Like Going Home, and obviously his masterful two-part biography of Elvis Presley, which is now the standard work on Elvis. And I suppose we're going to be touching on that a bit because we're talking about Peter's new book, The Colonel and the King, which is obviously about the partnership between Tom Parker and Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley describes as the partnership that rocked the world. Peter, can we start by just giving us a quick idea of your dealings with Colonel Parker? How do you first meet him and so forth?
Sure. No, I'll tell you that, but we really should have called it a partnership of equals because that's the theme of the book. But how I first met him, I went to the Elvis birthday dinner, which I'd never done before, and I have rarely done since, in January of '88, because Colonel was advertised as being there. I'm going to try to keep this short.
Right.
And so I thought, okay, well, I'll never get to meet him, but I can absorb his aura. I was sitting with Sam Phillips.
Oh, that's pretty good for a start.
Well, I'd known him for a long time, although he still wasn't sure about me. It took another 5 years before he said, it took me a long time. My son Knox, he loved you from the moment he met you, but I didn't. And so 5 more years, maybe we were okay. But I was sitting with him, and he said, I think I'll go over and say hello to Tom. He ain't no damn colonel. He wasn't going to call him colonel. So being the, faithful journalist that I am, which is really an ironic kind of statement, I followed him to the table. I met Colonel. I then wrote to him when I got home and said it was so good meeting you. I heard back instantly, and that began a correspondence of nearly 10 years. What it led to directly was an invitation to his 80th birthday, which was just this phenomenal affair in which, through his intercession, by his inviting me, who knows why he invited me, I met all the people, the behind-the-scenes people in Elvis's life who otherwise would never have talked to me. There's a funny anecdote connected with that, but you don't want to hear that. So, but in any case, we continued our correspondence, but it was right around that time, it was right actually after that time, that after Last Train came out, Last Train to Memphis, Jack Soden, who was CEO at Graceland then and is still at Graceland today, said to me, if you asked me the question was, can I get into the archives? He said, if you ask me the same question you've been asking for the last 5 or 6 years, the answer will change. And the reason was because he had read the book, and I don't want to pat myself on the back, but he wrote me a wonderful letter about how the book embodied all the reasons that he felt he was doing the job he was doing. But anyway, it made a favorable impression. Like I say, I'm not the guy to go, like this.
Yeah.
So then Alexandra and I, my wife Alexandra and I, went down and we went to the warehouse, this vast warehouse where all of Colonel's papers, which Jack had bought 2 or 3 years before, maybe 5 years before, I'm not sure. And they were just sitting there in their unvarnished glory. They were sitting there in the traveling trunks. They were sitting there in the battered, the battered file cabinets, exactly the way that Colonel had them in his office and home in Madison, Tennessee. They were transported exactly as was. So we started looking at things. I mean, it wasn't that there was disorder. It was just we were not indoctrinated into the order. And so we started looking at things. And each of us, Alexandra and I, started looking at letters, and they just showed a Colonel Parker that, despite the fact that at this point I'd known him for 5 or 6 years, was completely different than any Colonel Parker I had encountered, either on the page or in person. And Alexander would call to me and says, "You've got to see this. Look at this letter to Eddie Arnold." And it was just, but they revealed a person, a depth, and a kind of both an ingenuity and an eloquence with spelling, which the kind of spelling you would expect from someone who never got past the fourth grade in Holland, and with made up grammar, and syntax was, original. And it looked, some of them looked like, the original manuscript for Jack Kerouac's On the Road. I mean, they were stream of consciousness, and they might as well have been typed on a, ream of telegraph paper. So anyway,
give us an example of something that you read that made you think about him differently.
It was all of them. It was all of them. I mean, the intelligence of the letters, the depth of thinking, the humor. I mean, the letters are all through the book, and I don't think I could. One of the letters, which I didn't find at the time, was a letter to Elvis in '57, where he just expresses how dedicated he is to Elvis and how dedicated they are to each other. And he writes to Elvis, "You are just like me, very sensitive, but only people we know, only people we love can hurt us." And it goes on in that vein. There were any number of letters in which he revealed his true emotions in a way that he was disinclined to in life. But there were other letters which were just hilarious and which were intended to be hilarious, and in which he was fencing, as he did in his correspondence with me. He always won. I never came close to winning a battle of the wits or a verbal battle. But he had this group of people, particularly the publicity people in Hollywood, who clearly they all got a kick out of each other. They all tried to outdo each other. But as Colonel wrote in another letter, which has struck me so over the years, as he wrote this letter to a friend of his, Paul Wilder, who was a newspaperman in Tampa, who had written Colonel up a great deal when Colonel worked for the Humane Society of Tampa, as an animal control officer. It wasn't just dogs, it was every kind of animal. He loved animals and children. It was the greatest job he ever had in his life. But he wrote to Paul Wilder about this International Snowmen's League, or just Snowmen's League, which he had formed, which is an imaginary association to which not everybody gained membership. I mean, nor could you apply for membership, but you had to have a certain quality. But he wrote to Paul Wilder, he says, "Well, okay, you're on trial, Paul, as a snowman. You tried too hard in the letter you wrote to me then, but that's characteristic of people who are not sure of themselves as snowmen. But there are several things to remember, snowing being putting people on. I mean, it's that whole battle of wits. There are several things to remember about snowing. One is you only snow people for the good." And he's totally serious about it. The other is you never snow another snower. You never. The third thing is, and this is something to remember in our, personal relationships, if a fellow snower tries to snow you, act like you're snowed just to make him feel better, because you may very well see right through it. And the fourth rule is never try too hard. But those are the kind of letters. So to me, this was a window. We could talk about the business. We could talk about all kinds of things. It was a window into that world too, but it was a window into what motivated Colonel, into the person that he never revealed in public, being the kind of person who created his own myth. I mean, talk about a self-invented man. There has never been a more self-invented, let's just say, person than Colonel. And there's never been anyone more truly American than Colonel, despite the fact that he was Dutch.
There you go. So so give us the myth, because you're saying you discovered a person richer and more complex than the world would have thought. What's the world's view of Colonel Parker, over the years? Can you give us an idea of that?
Well, the thing about Colonel was, you say, what was his reputation? He had the greatest reputation in the world. He was perceived as by far, the most forward-thinking, the best, the greatest manager that had ever been, up through, I would say, at least 1968. So what the world now thinks of him has nothing to do with the reputation he carried with him then. As far as what Colonel did to further his reputation, what he did to further his reputation was, and I've talked to virtually everyone he did business with. I mean, that's an idle boast. I've talked to so many people. There's not a single person who did not consider him to be a man of his word, a person of the utmost integrity. And this comes through in the letters, a person who would always stick to the terms of the deal and with whom you only needed a handshake to be able to count on. Again, that's not the view that people have today, but that has nothing to do with the actual facts. But the final thing...
Today, people think of him as being self-interested, manipulative, controlling Elvis, stopping him touring abroad, and it's not a very flattering impression, is it?
No, it isn't at all. But the only thing I would say, and again, I'm not trying to say, oh, I'm so great or anything like that, but people have never seen the true facts. None of these letters, I'm not interested in either defending or condemning him. That has nothing to do with it. Everything I've ever written I've intended to be descriptive. And if I'm describing Elvis, I want to describe the real person, not the mythic person. Now, when I started writing about Elvis before Last Train came out, I would say he was often perceived as a person who was totally manipulated. He was like a puppet. And Sam Phillips was the genius, and he had created this great music at Sun Records. And then Elvis had fallen into, an artistic desuetude. But Colonel Parker totally manipulated. Nobody manipulated Elvis. Elvis was the most stubborn person in the world. You could disagree with his decisions. You might offer him financial advice, as virtually everyone, including his father, did. He wasn't going to listen to you. He was going to do what he wanted to do because Elvis, just like the Colonel, cared not one whit about money. He didn't care about accumulating money, just as Colonel did not care one bit about accumulating money. For Elvis, money was to spend, and he always spent. Let's say in 64, I think I looked this up recently. In 64, I think he made $2 million, which was would be the equivalent of about 20 million today. That wasn't anywhere near enough for him to do the things he wanted to do. It wasn't necessarily that he indulged himself. I mean, he did, but he enjoyed spending money. Colonel enjoyed losing money. He had no interest in keeping it. He kept $1 million in the bank at all times. He left his widow, Loanne, $1 million when he died. And he kept it in the bank for fear that, and there are many letters from Elvis, from Vernon, Elvis's father, Vernon, in the book, saying, you've got to help me. Elvis is driving us into the poorhouse. We're going to lose Graceland. You've got to get us money from RCA. This was a constant theme. Colonel kept $1 million in the bank against that rainy day that might come when Elvis really went over. He wouldn't lose everything. He would spend everything. He overspent, and I'm not saying that to condemn him. This is the life he led. It's the life he chose to lead. Hey, wouldn't we all like to have $20 million?
But it's fair to say that they were both very, very motivated by money, weren't they? Elvis because he spent it all the time and needed more, and as you say, Tom Parker because he was losing it and was addicted to gambling to some extent.
Well, he was addicted to gambling, but and became addicted in the once Elvis started in Las Vegas. This had never manifested itself before, and somebody like Julian Aberback, who co-owned Hill and Range, and who went back with Colonel to Eddie Arnold. And knew him very well and admired him very much, and said something happened to him in Las Vegas. And whether it was the pressure, whether it was the deterioration of his relationship with Elvis, he was, as his wife Loanne described him, a wife who admired him as much as she adored him. I mean, she could not have been a more loving wife, and yet she felt obligated because when I started the biography, it wasn't going to be a biography; it was going to be a collection of records of letters. But she became, I'd known her at that point. We were going to do the collection of letters, I would say, back around 2000, 2001. Jack Soden and I had agreed on that. And then not long after that, Lisa Marie sold the estate, and there were many complications, and we just weren't able to do it. In the meantime, Loanne Parker, Colonel's second wife, his widow, had we'd been in touch with each other. And I told her what I was doing. And then she started talking to me. And she felt, as I did, that Colonel had never received his rightful place in history. And she wanted people to know the Colonel Parker, not without warts, the Colonel Parker, but the true Colonel Parker, and the person who was in his own way as creative, as much of a genius, in my view. I mean, you may not agree, as much of a genius in what he did, and as creative as Sam Phillips was in the studio, and as Elvis was in making his music. And these were three totally different dimensions. None of them they overlapped, but they connected, but none of them overlapped. Colonel never made any contributions to the music. He never went into the studio with Elvis, except maybe when Elvis returned from the Army, he was in the studio, but he had nothing whatsoever to do with the music. He was there simply to further Elvis's ability to make the music he wanted to make. And that's the whole story at the beginning of the book, Colonel defending Elvis.
Right. So, but there were certain things that he was particularly keen on. I'm particularly zipping about. It's a huge story. He was particularly keen on Christmas, and Elvis being identified with Christmas, wasn't he? Tell us the story about the 1968 TV special and his insistence.
Okay,
go on.
The 1968 TV special. I've got to say one thing though. Or now I've forgotten what it was I was going to say. You would ask me, about the myth or the legend. Colonel created his own myth. He created his own legend, and he gloried in the myth. And it was not a negative myth, and it was one that people enjoyed. But essentially, it was he and Elvis were perceived as the rubes who arrived in Hollywood, and Colonel and Elvis chortled between themselves. There was nobody. Nobody else was in on their meetings except for Elvis's father, Vernon. But they chortled among themselves. They say, "Who is the rube now?" When time and so Colonel created, and there's much more to that, but that was not particularly a negative side. But you asked about the '68 special.
Yeah, go on. Okay.
I'm going to tell you something that you're going to say, "Well, that's not what people think," but it's just the truth. I mean, and it's borne out simply by the records. Why did Colonel like Christmas songs? You could answer the question. What unique property do Christmas songs have?
They sell a lot.
They sell year after year. Christmas comes around every year. And
unfailingly, yes.
Mother's Day isn't bad, too.
It's true, the same song resells, doesn't it?
Yes, it can. Or you can record new ones, But, and he had done the same thing with Eddie Arnold. Yes, he believed in that. He made a deal that when the movies had run out, there was very little money left in movies by 1967. And he couldn't get the money, which was nearly $1 million at that point, plus profit participation for Elvis for a movie. There was nobody who was making more money in Hollywood than Elvis. And you could say it was nobody doing it with less effort. But the point was, this had run out. And he went to NBC was it Tom Sarnoff, I think General Sarnoff's son, and wanted to make a movie deal. And what he did was he what do you call it when you put things together? You batch things.
Right.
He batched a
package. Yeah.
All right. He put together a movie and a TV special, which Elvis had not been on television since 1960, with when he returned from the Army and he did the Frank Sinatra special. Those together made up about $1 million. So it was a good deal. The special was going to be a Christmas special to be broadcast the following Christmas. It made perfect sense along the lines of the Christmas special, radio Christmas special that he did with Eddie Arnold in 1948, let's say, which was very successful, the album he put out. At the first meeting, this is the part that I think it is what it is. At the first meeting of the Singer, it's not the Singer Sewing Machine Company, but it's the Singer Company that makes sewing machines. They were the sponsor. RCA, Colonel, and I'm trying to think who would be is there a fourth? Well, anyway, the first meeting of all of these interested parties, a man named Alfred DeScipio. This was before. Did I say NBC? NBC, RCA, NBC, RCA, Colonel, and Singer. So a man named Alfred DeScipio, who was the artistic director of Singer, and it's not a laugh, he created a lot of specials. And he said to Colonel, the creative team had not been hired at this point. He said to Colonel, you want to do a Christmas special, a special which celebrated Elvis's contributions to American music, that covered the whole gamut of all the great songs that he's done. It introduced Elvis as a revolutionary force in American music. This would be much better. So you know what Colonel's answer was? It was great. He said, great. It never changed. That he was totally committed to that thing. He said there just has to be one Christmas song, because that was in the original contract, And that was the entire thing. He supported the special totally. He had nothing to do with it creatively. Not long after that meeting, the creative team of Steve Binder and Bones Howe was hired. Steve Binder did a brilliant job of filming, particularly, Bones Howe said he was the best, I'd hope, cinematographer, director there was, somebody who could catch things on the fly. And, the ad lib, the spontaneous moments, the boxing ring sequence, which was in the original script. That just didn't come about by accident. But he did it. Steve Binder did a great job. Colonel was on the set all the time, doing nothing but cheering everybody on. There was no conflict. There was no nothing. He saw this as a tremendous advancement of Elvis's career. And in fact, it was, because within days of its broadcast, Colonel booked Elvis into Las Vegas, which was another great challenge and something he was positive that Elvis could rise to. I mean, that was another $1 million a year, as it turned out. So what he did, the only conflict that existed, and believe me, I talked with there's one person who talks about conflict, and it's conflict with one person, but I'm not going to go into that. Every other person, Bones Howe, Billy Goldenberg, the music director, the RCA producer, the NBC producer, I'm forgetting his name now, great guy, who spent most of his time with Colonel on set playing a game called Honesty, in which Colonel would say, "What number am I thinking of?" And this guy would he would be wrong 15 times in a row, and then he'd be right, and Colonel would fork out the money. But every one of them talked about Colonel as nothing but a positive force, but not contributory. He would be the last person to claim he made the deal. And the only conflict there ever was in the final cut when they showed the show. This is in August, I think, in the summer anyway, '68. There was no Christmas song, and Colonel wrote to Tom Sarnoff and said, "You're a man of your word. It's in the contract. If you don't want to do one Christmas song, then fine. Let's just abrogate the contract. We'll do a Christmas special, and we can do another show some other time." But in any case, all that was he said, this was your word, and Sarnoff said, "You're right." And the one song which they had filmed for the special went back, which was Blue Christmas, which Elvis loved. Elvis, by the way, loved Christmas songs, so this is not for do it. And that went back into the show, and that was it.
I love the idea in your book. You've got the whole of the letter where he's talking about, well, it was all very good. I watched, we watched the playback and so forth, but it didn't have the Christmas song. And it's really long and detailed, the letter, isn't it? I mean, the letter was his kind of medium, wasn't it, generally, throughout his career?
Yes, no, he was a great, he wrote to one woman who was in the legal department, I think, at Paramount. And she had written to him, she had a sports car club there or something. And he said, if I had written back to you any sooner, my reply would have gotten there before your letter got to me. That was true.
I love the way that in the letters that you get an idea of the extent to which he wanted to kind of mould Elvis. There's one where he talks about advising Elvis against smutty comedy on stage. And another one, I think, to the William Morris Agency, where he notes that as James Dean has just died, he's suggesting to these film company that there's a gap in the market for someone with the same kind of moody, enigmatic appeal. That's very strategic thinking, isn't it?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I don't mean to be contradictory, and I want to just put on a sunny personality. But I'll tell you, the reason I don't think so is because that's what Elvis wanted to do. Right. Elvis was totally committed to doing a James Dean, a Marlon Brando type of movie. And Colonel, if you read the letters over and over again, Colonel is, in those early years, Colonel is writing to William Morris, and he's writing to the studio saying, Elvis wants to do a straight dramatic role. At one point he writes to the William Morris agent who had been assigned to him, I think in December of '57, I believe, saying Elvis has made 3 movies in a row that are the same. And the second 2, Jailhouse Rock, Loving You and Jailhouse Rock, were much better. And there's no question. But Colonel was a very keen observer. He didn't miss, he wouldn't have been a great director or a great screenwriter, but he was a very keen observer. And he said, so they're a big improvement. But Elvis does not want to do the same movie over and over again. And for instance, at one point he wrote to Elvis, he had an offer for a lot of money, and it didn't specify how much, from MGM. And he said, you can take this if you want, but I don't think this is what you want, because it wasn't this kind of role that Elvis was looking for. Not the role that Colonel was looking for, the role that Elvis was looking for. That's why, and even, for instance, when he wrote to Bob Neal in it was August or September of '55 about that festival, White River Festival or something in Arkansas. He had already returned money to the promoter because so many people had complained about what I am sure would hardly seem smutty today. No. But his view was Elvis was the greatest talent he had ever met, the greatest singer, and every single one of his letters, for instance, in that right after Elvis was signed with RCA, every letter he wrote to RCA, to William Morris, to the movie studios, every single letter said, and to the television people, was, I am not going to have you dictate to my artist what he is to do. My artist knows his business. He will do the best thing for him. He is the best judge. I am not dictating to him what he does. When his good friend William Morris wrote to him and said, everybody here in the office is upset about Elvis's appearance on Milton Berle, the second appearance, essentially what Colonel wrote back was, they'll get over it. And Maya will continue to do what he wants to do and what he sees. And when he made the contract with Ed Sullivan, he got this jubilant note, I think, from William Morris, saying Sullivan has agreed to pay $50,000 for 3 appearances, which is a staggering sum at that time. Still be pretty good, I'd take it. But and Colonel said, that's fine, but we need to have it explicitly agreed upon, what Sullivan has already said, that Elvis has total control over the songs he sings, over the manner in which he presents them, over the musicians that appear with him, and over his entire appearance. So that's why, again, I don't mean to be...
But that was a reaction to the televised singing to the hound dog top hat incident, wasn't it? That he felt he needed more control over what... Well,
you're right, but the Steve Allen thing was the only time that he didn't insist on that control. So,
right.
Right.
But it also, again, you have to see the context of the times. Elvis was being denounced in, I forget what the Catholic National magazine was. He was being denounced from the pulpit. He was being denounced from the political forums. He was being denounced. He was being denounced from all sides. And Steve Allen wavered as to whether or not he could put Elvis on, and came up with what he said was a cute idea.
Yes.
I think at that point, Colonel's judgment, but I don't have any record of this, but I would imagine Colonel's judgment was always, it's better to have something than nothing. And that we can make something of this. But as soon as Elvis had done that appearance, and you're right, there was a tremendous reaction among the fans. How can they make Elvis do that? Colonel did not hesitate in just regaining lost ground.
Is it also the case when you talk about Elvis did what he wanted and the Colonel facilitated it as best he could? It doesn't explain why he never played overseas, never performed overseas. I mean,
this is a very complicated thing.
Go on.
Up until 1960, you'll see in the letters, Colonel is speaking of, and I think seriously speaking of, a world tour. I don't think that this issue of his not being an American citizen, not him in particular, was that much of an issue in America of the 1950s. You have someone like Wilhelm de Kooning, came over the same year as a stowaway from Holland, same year as Colonel in 26. He did not become a citizen until 1962. And it would appear that he traveled to Europe in the meantime, whether you could get a passport because you had a driver's license. Somebody like Prince Mike Romanoff arrived in this country, a prominent Hollywood restaurateur and a great character, somebody who should have a book of his own, or maybe he does. But he arrived in this country long before Colonel did, never became a citizen until the end of Eisenhower's administration. He got thrown out a number of times, but he kept coming back. There was no ice. There was no. So Colonel was serious about I believe, and it was through the Australian. It was a promoter, Lee Gordon, and Australia was probably the most likely place to start. But he also speaks to Abe Lastfogel, his best friend in the business, who's the head of William Morris, and a less likely partnership, friendship you couldn't find, and yet they were both devoted to each other. And Abe Lastfogel admired Colonel endlessly. But he's writing to him through 1960 about a world tour. So I think his brother's name is spelled Odd, but all my Dutch friends say you pronounce it Ott. But his brother's visit in 1961, I think, spooked him. And there's never, and it occurred to him, he didn't want Colonel stood on his own ground. He was not somebody who wanted to admit to error or to ask for help. So he did not want a secret to get out, and I promised, that it wasn't going to get out, and it didn't, although everybody in Holland knew he was Dutch. So that shows you the kind of communication it was.
Yes.
Why? But all right, to get around to why didn't Elvis go to, travel abroad in it would be the 70s at this point. The Colonel,
as you say, there's a Japanese promoter offered him $1 million. And that Tom Parker said that he didn't feel that Elvis wanted to do the tour, but it was on the table. There was an offer, wasn't there?
There were many offers. I'm sure that wasn't the only offer. That's the only offer I cited. But there are a number of things to take into account. I'll start off by saying Colonel said if Elvis were to travel abroad, they would never be able to provide the security which Elvis required and which Colonel provided for him on his domestic tour. I'm going to circle around to security. I want to say one.
What do you mean by security? You're talking about.
I want to circle around that. The first thing is, did Elvis really want to go abroad? Did he want to go to Europe? When I spoke to Priscilla, his wife Priscilla, she said all the guys wanted to go to Europe, and Elvis, in fact, sent both Joe Esposito and Jerry Schilling to Europe, on a vacation. He was very close to them, and it was a wonderful vacation. I think they went to Greece. Priscilla said all the guys wanted to go to Europe, and Elvis acted like he wanted to go to Europe. This would be in the 60s. But when we got behind closed doors, he didn't want to go to Europe in the least, and they wound up going to the Bahamas instead, but there was a hurricane. But the point was, she said, now, that was behind closed doors with me. I wasn't behind closed doors with them, so I can't guarantee that. But she said when he talked to me that he never exhibited any interest in returning to Germany, where he would say, or any. No. Okay, what does security mean?
Yeah.
What it came to mean, and I am quite sure this is true. Colonel never said this to me, but Tom Hewlett, who was really the person who was closest to him, did all the promoting. Colonel relied on him completely, and he had come back from the Japanese tour. That he was the person who brought the Japanese promoter to the show, or at least he knew the Japanese promoter with $1 million. And who had he taken to? Do you remember who he took to Japan? I want to say Vanilla Fudge, but it's
Moody Blues, wasn't it?
It's some, but he was very successful.
Took the Beatles to Japan. This guy as well.
Not Tom Hewlett.
Oh, right, wasn't it? Okay.
The Japanese promoter. Yes. No, he was a very significant Japanese promoter. He could have put on a show. But in talking with Tom Hewlett, and also in talking with many of the guys around Elvis, what would security mean? It wouldn't mean that they couldn't keep Elvis safe from the fans or from the threats. It would mean Elvis's security. Who was going to carry the drugs?
Yes.
Who was going to carry the guns? Elvis didn't go anywhere without. The guys were totally loyal. Would Charlie Hodge have carried the drugs?
Yeah,
probably. But
they carried guns too.
They carried guns too, and they carried doctors. Who prescribed it. In other words, this was a concomitant.
By doctors, you mean dealers, really?
No, they're doctors who wrote prescriptions.
Yeah,
physicians who probably couldn't write prescriptions abroad. But that wasn't the big thing. He needed to have his drugs. Now, when Tom Hewlett, the guys were so excited when Tom Hewlett came back from Japan. I think this was around 1974. And they said, this is it. And I'm not trying to make light of the guys. Each one of them was different. They all had different qualities. They were bright. And a good number of them did their best to intervene with Elvis or to suggest things to him, they all worked for Elvis. Elvis could say to anybody in his sight, including his father, "You don't like it, there's the door," and he did.
Yeah.
But the point was Tom Hewlett. So the guys all talked to Tom Hewlett about the tour he had led. He was a very successful promoter. He was the head of Concerts West. He was the person who, with Colonel, was most responsible for Elvis's touring in the 70s, which was enormously successful. And he said the guys were so excited about it, they were absolutely convinced and they said, "Elvis wants to talk to you," and they were convinced that the talk was going to lead to their going to Japan. Tom Hewlett said when he went back to talk to Elvis, he didn't show the least interest in going. He was interested to some extent in Tom Hewlett's observations, but Tom Hewlett walked away from that, not only knowing the concerns that would exist about taking Elvis on tour, because people were getting busted. I mean, different people were getting busted. Frank Sinatra had been in Australia a number of years.
So Elvis himself would have been worried about that aspect of it, of him being busted,
if he would have allowed that to go to the forefront of his thinking. He, for all we know, he could have found lots of rationalizations why it wouldn't be good, and he was comfortable with where he was. He liked being where he was.
Yeah.
So the person in the organization least interested in going overseas was Elvis Presley.
Yes, and I mean, and I feel
even though there were offers on the table all the time.
Yeah, sure.
They didn't need the offers.
No.
It is interesting because the general consensus, the Baz Luhrmann recent movie makes that point, that it's because of the Colonel not having a passport that that he kept him here in America and put him.
Would have made, for instance, here's an example. Colonel would have trusted Tom Hewlett totally.
Yeah.
He had misgivings about. He would not have trusted Jerry Weintraub, but he had no misgivings about Tom Hewlett. And he would have gladly seen Tom Hewlett take Elvis to Japan if he couldn't go, which you're probably right. He probably couldn't have gone. But that was not the same. Stop. But the biggest thing, you said it, the biggest thing was that the person who was least enthusiastic about going to Japan, and I think we could come to reasonable conclusions as to why it is, but we don't know for sure, was Elvis Presley.
Yeah. And also, 1973, I think it's 1973, does a deal with RCA to pretty much sell the royalty stream on his recordings, for what is it, $5 million, which seems, in the light of the kind of deals being done nowadays over people's catalogues, seems like small change. But the prime mover behind that was Elvis, wasn't it? Needing the cash.
Yes, Elvis was desperate for the cash, and again, I keep coming back to the fact that I didn't publish, but I saw, I'm going to say a passel of letters, whatever George Romney said about something of women, a file folder of whatever. That was the word I always looked for, of letters from Vernon to Colonel, begging Colonel to help them out. Maybe Colonel could talk to Elvis, which wasn't, and persuade him that he should reduce his spending. But more than that, they desperately needed money. And this is not, I'm not just talking about the sale of the Masters, but because they were going to lose Graceland. They were going to, and Colonel, couldn't Colonel make some deal with RCA? And he always did. But the thing about the sale of the Masters was this was something Colonel was against. And the reason was, and you can see this throughout his career, he believed in ownership. I mean, ownership was everything. And that allowed you to exploit the rights forever. It allowed you to, put out the same Christmas single every year and get, 500,000. But the point was, you were in control. When he remonstrated with Vernon, I don't think he talked to Elvis about this, that this was not a good idea. Vernon said, "We're going to do it." Elvis had problems with the divorce, which was coming with Priscilla. I mean, it was finalized about 7 or 8 months later. But and when Colonel said he didn't want to do it, he didn't think it was a good idea, Vernon said, "All right, fine. We will get Ed Hookstratton, Elvis's personal lawyer, to make the deal." Now, I talked to Ed Hookstratton, not necessarily about that, or not that specifically about that particular deal, but I don't think Ed Hookstratton would ever have done it. He was totally loyal to Colonel and very much admired Colonel. But irrespective of that, at that point, just as when Eddie Arnold told Colonel he wanted to get off the road, he didn't want to make personal appearances anymore, and Colonel said, "I think you're making a mistake." This is back in around 52. when Colonel was managing and brilliantly managing Eddie Arnold. Colonel, argued against that when he realized this is what Eddie Arnold wanted to do, because Eddie Arnold was a man of principle. He knew his mind. He then revised everything to suit what Eddie Arnold wanted. And when Colonel realized that Vernon and Elvis were not going to be, put off about selling the masters, he then got the price up from $3 million to $5.4 million, driving the RCA. Rocco Lancaster was the president, but he was sort of a minor figure in that. And I'm trying to remember the name of the person who was the financial affairs. Do you remember?
No, I don't. I could look it up, but don't. Yeah. Carry on.
But and he not only, he was beside himself. This is the head of financial affairs, and felt that this is paying too much. And when you say $5 million is nothing, you've got to think of it in terms of $2,025. It's a lot more than $5 million.
Yeah.
But anyway, and so after they've made the whole deal, Colonel's gotten everything he wants, and they go out to dinner in Palm Springs at the hotel, at the Spa Hotel in Palm Springs. Colonel is saying, "Okay, I'm glad we made the deal, but I'm going to have to be able to do this, and I'm going to have to be able to do that." And Mel Ilberman was the name of the financial affairs guy. And Mel says, "Wait a minute, that's what we just negotiated. You can't have." And meanwhile, Rocco Lancaster, Mel felt, wasn't understanding what was being done. And in the end, Colonel got further concessions. So, listen, we would have, believe me, all of us could have benefited by Colonel managing us.
but we might not have listened. I want to just talk about this briefly. Because people always think, people's cliched view of kind of big managers is that they're kind of in charge. They pull the strings and they get the artists to do what they want to do. But it would seem in the case of the Colonel and Elvis was in charge.
Yes,
really. Yeah. So even the Colonel could only just respond to whatever Elvis wanted to do.
No, but he would have protected us. That's all I'm saying. You imagine your worst, corporate fears, and Colonel would have stepped in and helped us out in that situation. Well,
you see, if the Colonel had given me advice, I would have listened.
Okay,
whereas the indication is Elvis probably didn't.
I think I'm carrying my metaphor too far, but the biggest thing the Colonel did, and what he sought to do, was to facilitate Elvis's ability, his artist's ability to make the music he wanted to make in the best way he could possibly make it. And, and Colonel believed so much. He wrote, "You are the greatest artist I've ever known. Nobody is comparable to you. You alone can do this." But he believed that Elvis could rise to any challenge, which is the whole reason for Aloha from Hawaii, when Elvis was in a sorry state. And Colonel came up with this grand idea and was positive. And it was an idea which he sold to that. Rocco Lancaster had just become president of RCA and was totally loved the idea of Colonel pitching it to him, because nobody had ever done it before, except for Nixon when he was in China, which is a very different thing.
Yeah.
If he could facilitate his ability to make music, why was he so incapable of controlling Elvis's personal life? Because he was watching it getting out of control. He cries at the end of the last concert because he realizes the situation he's in. Why could he not affect any kind of change over the way he lived his life?
Well, again, have any of the three of us ever been in an intervention? I haven't. But I do not discount how difficult an intervention is, nor do I discount how many times people did try to intervene in Elvis's life. Dr. Nick did. I'm not going to go into the detail. Red West did. Jerry Schilling did. Each in their own way. Vernon did. Priscilla did. And Colonel did, too, in his own way. And you can see in the letters, but I want to come back to why didn't he have more to affect Elvis's personal life more. But you can see in the letters where he writes to Elvis, for instance, in 73, and there's another second letter in 74, just before he opens in Vegas, but in 73, and he says, again, I'm just repeating myself, but you were the greatest performer I've ever known. There's nobody comparable to you, but you've got to do more for your audience. People are beginning to say, he says, nobody else will tell you this, but I am telling you this because I am your friend, because I believe in you, because only someone who cared as much about you would say this, and you have to expand your repertoire, and you alone can decide how to do this. And I know it'll be a great show, and maybe you'll decide to get rid of Thus Spake Zarathustra and come out the way you did at the beginning, just with to stride out on stage with the band. But so there was an example of he saw things going downhill and he attempted to intervene, but he made a point of pride. He never interfered with the music, and he never did, except to suggest that Elvis record "Are You Lonesome Tonight," which turned out pretty well. But he also said he made it a point that he never intervened in Elvis's personal life, and that they did not, and that if he should do so, and I think this would be the first rule of a manager, if he should do so, it will be the end of their professional relationship. He couldn't, he wasn't 20 years old when he met Elvis. Well, let's say he wasn't 21 when Elvis signed with Colonel. At that point in 1956 was 47 years old. And he said he just wasn't going to, and he did, I think also he didn't want to be around. And I think any parent can understand this, or there are other situations. You don't want to be around when bad things are happening, so that you want to be the person who can offer advice to try to help, to try to prevent bad things from happening, maybe. But you don't want to be witness to it. And there were things that happened, I didn't put this in the book, but there were things that happened at the beginning, particularly when some of Elvis's guys, there's one guy I knew particularly well, liked him, he wasn't around at the end, but did something very bad. And Colonel got it hushed up, and he attempted to get Elvis to understand that this put not only his friend at risk, but it put Elvis's entire career at risk. And there was a fallback. But his whole point was, I'm not there. I can't be there. I'm not going to be there for the parties. I wouldn't say, I think he thought he was his pal in the best sense. He was his truest friend, and he believed that Elvis was his truest friend. He really fell in love with Elvis, not the commercial prospects, from the first time he met him. And he said, Colonel was willing to give up everything he had. He was at the top of the entire, music business game. And he was prepared to walk away from that for this untried, untested, unproven talent, 20-year-old talent that nobody else was willing to go to bat for. So there was no question of the depth of his commitment to Elvis. But no, you're right. And who knows? I mean, maybe that's what a manager should do, but I don't think it works out well for most managers.
And he wasn't that good at controlling his own faults, really, was he? Obviously, there's a bit where you talk about him being in Las Vegas, and he quite liked this, the reputation he had, the big character at the roulette tables, I was quite in love with that level of celebrity, but he just couldn't control his losing money, there was nothing he could do about it appears.
He was a gambling addict, as Loanne I think of what it cost her to tell me this and to document it and to describe and this generally happened, it would appear that it generally happened both before and after the tours in the 70s. I mean, it didn't happen before the 70s, but it happened. And he, for whatever reason, felt under tremendous, for this person of infinite self-control. Yeah. There's nothing else in his life that doesn't show complete self-control. That's why, but she describes how he would be either before a tour, I think it was after a tour, 72, 73, he spent 3 days in the casino without coming back to the room. And when he came back, he was just, and he collapsed and, couldn't, was a broken man for 2 or 3 days. Not because he lost the money. The money meant nothing.
But he was gambling 24 hours a day for 3 days.
Yes.
You see, that's nobody's idea of fun, is it? That's not enjoyment. It's all that's
miserable.
That's miserable.
No. And Elvis, neither one of them was going to interfere in the other's life.
Yeah.
But each of them, in a sense, was addicted to something different, and each of them was afraid if they should bring up, maybe this comes back to the question you asked. If Elvis had brought up, look, you have these medications, you're increasingly suffering from an addiction to them. Then Elvis would come back and says, "Who are you to talk?" So Al Devoren described to me how Tom Diskin, who had been with Colonel almost from the beginning, confronted Colonel about this, and Colonel just turned, got apoplectic, get out of my sight. Nobody could talk to him about it any more than anybody could talk to Elvis about his problems. Right. But this is what, you asked me at the beginning, I think, about what I learned. This is why what I've written in this book is so entirely different. Not I don't mean on a negative sense, but in an overall sense. From what I wrote about Elvis, from Colonel in Careless Love, and from the portrait I drew of him in Looking to Get Lost, which was a portrait of my relationship, my quite confined relationship with Colonel, largely based on on our correspondence. And the point was, in each of those, in Careless Love, and I'm not disowning what I wrote. I mean, it's true to everything I understood at the time. But in Careless Love, Colonel was almost a Falstaffian character. He carries the narrative, and he's a figure of. Some people have described him as a lovable rogue or something. But there's never a falter in his pace. And the same is true when I describe him, and I describe him as truly as I knew him in Looking to Get Lost, in the chapter about him. He is a character. But here, he is a person of much greater depth, both in terms of his capabilities, in terms of his feelings, in terms of his vulnerability, in terms of his sensitivity, and in terms at the end, and of his appetites, of his addiction.
So, well, look, final question, and it's circle back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I think you said when Sam Phillips introduced you to him, he said, "I won't call him the Colonel" or something. He ain't no damn Colonel or whatever. But he was presumably the first famous kind of artist manager, wasn't he? I mean, people talked about Elvis and the Colonel even from early days. Would he have been as famous if he was just Tom Parker? Or was the Colonel a really important part of his branding?
The Colonel part was not, he thought it was a joke, and he referred to himself over and over again as a phony Colonel. And in his correspondence, he would refer to it. On the other hand, and this is contradictory of that, he might insist that the three of us should always call him Colonel. And that was part of the joke, but it was also, you didn't address him as anything but Colonel. But in terms of, no, I think that if you look at his management of Eddie Arnold, which was from roughly 42 to 53, it was maybe 43 to 53, it was about 10 years. The heights that he scaled there and the degree of respect, admiration, and awe in which he was held within the music industry at that time, and the success that Eddie Arnold achieved, an unparalleled success. Nobody came close to achieving it again. I mean, that's worth. People have written good, books about Eddie Arnold. I'm not claiming to be the first, but if you examine his, if you never got to Elvis, you would see somebody who was a genius as far as what he did went, and it didn't depend at all. He did get a colonel appointment towards the end of that time, but that wasn't what gave him his, charisma. He was charismatic in himself, and he was brilliant, and he was creative, and he was basically just a force of nature.
Well, look, there's the book, The Colonel and the King, Peter Guralnick, Tom Parker, Elvis Presley, and the partnership that rocked the world. Peter, it's been a delight talking to you.